So I'm Kristin Morris, and I'm here interviewing Ed Hoppitt today for the VMware Founders Collection. This interview will become part of the permanent collection at the Computer History Museum. Ed, thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us today.
You're welcome.
I always like to start with a bit about your background, educational background, career trajectory leading up to your time at VMware.
Okay, so my accent betrays me. I grew up on the east coast of the UK, a little town called Ipswich, just outside there. No one will know what that is, but they can Google it. And I had a fairly ordinary trip through school. So I studied. When did I go to what in America you call high school? So I was at high school in the early 90s. Left high school in 1996. And I think from an early age, I was always interested in technology and computers. And I remembered in the late 80s, my dad brought a BBC Micro home for us to look at and play with. And I was writing code probably before I went to high school, just playing with tech. And then high school was just fascinated at the opportunity that technology gave. Everyone was talking about the sort of the information age and moving into that. And so at school, I was really focused on tech. Anything to do with technology interested me. But I hadn't really.
Was there a program that offered technical skills, computer science courses?
We had courses at my high school that were focused around IT, but it tended to be how do you use computers. So it was how do you use Word, how do you use Excel. They weren't going sort of beyond that and giving people an insight into innovation and technology. And I think I saw past the lesson in Excel and past the lesson in Word and kind of had a realization that what was happening with the proliferation of compute and tech and it becoming more accessible and more democratized. When you coupled that with, in the early days it was CompuServe, AOL, and people just getting online, you could stand back and see like a perfect storm starting to happen. And that perfect storm really started to build, I guess, in the mid-90s. So in 1996, I was deciding what I wanted to go and do at university. And at first, I almost decided to go and do professional stage lighting design, because that's obviously the choice to make. And I remember I had a great conversation with my parents where they said to me, that could be quite vocational. Have you considered doing something a bit broader? And so the other option was to go and do a degree in computer science. But even that worried me a little bit, because I was concerned that a degree in pure computer science wouldn't necessarily make me look employable. It would potentially look very academic coming into business. So I ended up with doing a joint honours degree. So I did a degree in computer science with international business and management. Came out of school into university, had a great time. I went to Royal Holloway, which is part of the University of London. If anyone's seen it, it basically looks like Hogwarts from Harry Potter. Had an amazing 3 years there. Got to use and play with some incredible technology, and learned the craft of computer science. Understanding the basic foundations of what it is that makes the technical world that we live in work today. There'll be people that will remember the books of Tannenbaum on networking and all that kind of stuff. They still sit on my shelf at home. I don't read them very much these days, but they're still there. And as I went through uni into my second year and my third year, it was actually my dad who worked for British Telecom, for BT, a sort of UK version of an AT&T. And he said, look, what I don't want you to do when you graduate, don't go and get a job at BT, because you'll just get comfy, it won't push you, it's too easy. He'd been a lifer at BT. He'd spent his whole life from graduate to retirement working for BT. So I ignored that and got a job working for BT. I did 2 summer intern placements with them, and at the end of the second summer, I remember my boss at the time, he basically went, well, I suppose if you graduate, we should probably offer you a job. So that was the motivation that I went into my third year at university with, is just make sure you graduate and you've got a job. And so I joined BT in a growing bit of the business that was looking after what back in the day was called managed hosting. It was effectively your computer in our building. I was a detailed network designer. So I spent my life, designing switch networks, ingress, egress networks, for those managed hosting environments that our customers were going to be using and looking after, and we were going to be managing for them. And that was that's my trajectory sort of from, right the way from those early days of seeing a BBC Micro and playing with it and getting my head around it to exiting school into university in those first few days in a career.
So was your dad right? Did you get too comfortable at BT? Was it too easy?
No, he wasn't right. I could have got comfortable. It's a great company to work for. It has a great culture, but it's definitely a company that encourages the lifer. And eventually, I progressed through the organisation. I remember I spent probably about the first year, working in this network design role, and then one of my colleagues, effectively my internal customer, the sales-facing bit of the company I worked for, they suddenly realised I could speak to customers. They said, "Wow, he has a talent for talking to customers. He can explain complex technical stuff to a customer." And so I got pulled out of that design role and put into a customer-facing role. I guess at the time it was effectively pre-sales, right? I didn't understand pre-sales was a thing, but effectively I was stepping into a pre-sales role. And I took that foundational understanding of technology and IT and started to apply it into how do I describe to a customer how I'm going to help them solve their problems using the technology and products that we had on the shelf as a company at BT.
Mm-hmm. So how did you land at VMware?
By luck. So at BT, we were doing managed hosting. So a company would come to us and they'd say, "Look, we don't want our own data center. We want you to host the servers for us, manage the servers, manage the network, and we'll pay you monthly to do that." And in the early days, that was very traditional. More servers, more applications, and then I'll never forget. It must have been about 2005, 2006-ish. And you're keeping up with trends and what's happening, and this little jumped up startup company starts to appear, being mentioned, VMware. Oh, interesting. Wonder what they do. And it was really interesting. So for us in the managed hosting business, the point of demarcation of where we sort of left off and the customer's responsibility picked up was really clearly defined at the operating system, right? So we would manage the infrastructure, the network, the wide area network. We'd manage the heat, power, cooling, the data center. We'd patch the operating system, and then we'd hand you the keys. And you could do whatever you wanted north of the operating system. And so suddenly we started having this conversation around this new concept of virtualization. And it was really interesting because one of the people that I worked with, who was one of the product managers, he was like, "Oh, this will never catch on." And we're not interested in it because that's an application, right? That's if the customer wants to install, because I think at the time, it was Workstation and stuff like that. If the customer wants to install that, that's fine. They're welcome to, but it's nothing to do with us. And that kind of carried on for probably a longer than it should have done before there was a realization that actually no, this represents a shift in how people are going to want to build and consume compute. And so I remember working to understand how can we bring this new VMware thing in? How can we help customers, procure and rent fewer servers from us and slice and dice those servers up into these virtual servers? And so that was my first contact with VMware. And I remember talking about virtualization because we're effectively having to now sell this. We called it Client Island. That was the name of the product. And it was basically making a point that this was an island of compute for an individual client. And I remember standing up vSphere or ESX and playing with it. And I still remember my first vMotion moment as this, seemingly impossible thing happened where, a running thing that was on this box appeared on this box almost instantaneously. And you have to remember, we take this for granted today. But I can remember doing data center exit strategy, helping people migrate from one platform to another. And before then, moving a database between two servers was a massive piece of engineering. It was planning, preparation, testing. And then you came to the day when you were actually going to migrate the thing. And you were really worried. He says, trying not to use any expletives, but you were really expletive worried, and we forget that today because we take that ability for granted. So I remember my first vMotion moment, and then I remember going to my first VMworld. So I said, I need to know more about this ecosystem. There's something in this. And I think at that point, my career and trajectory kind of changed. And rather than being much more sort of like networky, general focused, I said, like, this is going to be really big. You can see, or I could see a whole bunch of directions, industries this would touch, and how it was going to influence how people could do things with IT. And so I started to pay much more attention to VMware. So I think it was 2006 in Los Angeles was the one that I went to, and I remember flying out. I'd never really been to a big IT conference before, so I was really excited. And yeah, I remember just being blown away. It was for people that weren't there at the time, but might remember the rise of Docker, for example. The early Docker cons that were run by Docker were just like the early VMworlds. It was edgy. It was, this thing has the potential to be really big, but it's not quite there yet. And so I remember I went to a couple of the VMworlds, and we started using VMware more and more. It then got to the point where rather than us persuading customers to take this virtualized tech, the customers were coming to us and saying, we want you to design as a managed, hosted, virtualized system. And it was an amazing experience to ride alongside VMware. We were a large customer, multiple millions of dollars of spend, and that afforded us a front seat at the show, as it were. I remember going out with Diane Green in Cannes when VMworld Europe was hosted there. We had one of our execs doing a main stage keynote with her. And got the awesome chance to just chat to Diane and listen to her passion for what she was building, and she was lovely because it was, Diane was so unassuming. It was like the VMworld was a bit like going to something hosted by your gran, because this lovely lady would walk on stage and she'd always look a little bit surprised that everyone had even turned up, and she was just so humble, and she'd sort of walk out and you could almost see in her head she was going, wow. You all came. Wow. And so eventually I started to think, maybe there's an opportunity to go and work for VMware. I believe in the cause. I believe in the direction. Everyone I know who works for the company enjoys working for the company. And so it was in what was a terrible decision for VMware. It was actually the BT account manager, who was responsible for the account, of which I was a massive influencer in the account by that point, referred me for a role at VMware. And I remember thinking at the time, this is a terrible account decision that you're making. It was just to the point that VMware was moving into a sort of phase 2 of its life. So if you think of phase 1, that we were predominantly selling vSphere. vSphere was a really easy sell in the early days. Once you won someone over that the thing worked, it was almost like for every $1 you spend, you're going to save 10. So how many dollars would you like to spend? As we built a more complex product portfolio, that sales process became harder. And so VMware was setting up an organization called Advisory Services. And Advisory Services was supposed to help customers understand the value of making investments in VMware. So rather than the pure technical story and the pure technical sell, it was engaging with business owners and customers rather than the technical people, and saying, well, how are we going to help you change this? How can we align the technologies that we're producing to the direction that you want to take your business? And so I think I was like employee number 3 in the UK for the Advisory Services organization. I was a business solutions architect. So my role was to help the customer understand what architectural choices they could make strategically to align what they were trying to do with VMware to their own business goals and stuff. So I hadn't joined into a technical role. I joined into this sort of strategic advisory role, which is very different from where I'd been at BT. And it's really strange. BT was great, but I hit a glass ceiling. Progression, it was an old school company, and I was working in Dubai for BT, seeing customers doing stuff. When my offer came through, the interview was hilarious. I loved the interview. At the bottom of my CV there is one throwaway line, and it says also current reigning Robot Wars world champion and BattleBots competitor. And the interview started with, let's talk about that. That looks really interesting. And that was a chapter of my life that was hilarious fun. But the whole first interview with VMware was just centered around, what on earth was that? Tell us all about it. And I remember I came back from my final interview, and I was really nervous because I'd never had a job interview before, right? Remember, the first job that I got, my intern boss said, if you graduate, we'll have you back. And so I found myself sitting in the offices in Frimley in the UK, which is a tiny little town on the west side of London, where obviously all multi-billion-dollar companies try and base themselves from. And I remember sitting there absolutely petrified and had this job interview. I thought I'd made a mess of it. I basically told one of the interviewers to shut up at one point. We were role-playing some stuff, and I thought they were trying to be a disruptor in this role-play scenario, so I just shut them down. And I'm sat in Dubai, late June, and bing, up comes this email with an offer from VMware. We'd like to employ you. And I thought about it for so long, and it was a life-changing offer. I mean, it was from a opportunity perspective, it was incredible. From a remuneration perspective, it almost doubled my income. But I agonized for a week. I was good at what I did at BT. I'd been there for 13 years, and you have this imposter syndrome moment where you suddenly think, am I good at what I do because I know everything about everything in the company? I know how to get stuff done. People come to me to fix problems and make stuff happen. Or am I actually really good at my craft? And so I started questioning myself. And then eventually I just thought, you know what, I've just got to go for it. And so, I was sat in my hotel room looking out at the Burj across the Dubai skyline, and I remember accepting the job. And I think my start date was something like the 4th of July 2012. I remember it because 2012 was the year London hosted the Olympics. And I was loosely connected with the team that was building the platform for that. At the time, it was the largest online event in history. And I remember the first assignment I got with VMware was going and doing some work in sub-Saharan Africa for our colleagues down in Johannesburg. And I remember sitting watching the London 2012 Olympic opening ceremony from my hotel room in Johannesburg, thinking about all the fun that my BT colleagues were having and wondering as I sat on my own in a hotel in Johannesburg whether I'd made the right decision or not. But that's pretty much my journey into VMware from BT, and I still owe a debt of gratitude to the guy. Craig Talbot was his name. He was the BT global account manager who referred me into VMware.
When you joined, was there also for you a sense of culture shock going from a sort of very established
total culture shock
British powerhouse company to not a startup anymore? VMware was definitely in its maturing years, but it's
relative
Silicon Valley.
Relative to where I was coming from. So relative to where I was coming from, it was a startup.
Yes.
BT was a great place to work, but it had a policy for everything. It had time to mature and build that approach, and it worked for BT, right? It's what it had got used to. So I'm used to a rule or a policy or a process for everything. And joining VMware in 2012, there was a rule, process, or policy for nothing. Everything was just do it and ask for forgiveness later, and if it seems like a good idea, you're probably okay. I think it was probably if you think about a startup in terms of like as humans grow up, I think VMware at that point was probably just becoming a teenager, right? It kind of knew that it needed some rules, wasn't really a big fan of rules, and so you'd find this sort of strange dichotomy where people would sort of like suggest maybe we should bring in a policy for this. I remember little things like in Frimley, because we were quite away from Heathrow, we had a taxi account with a local taxi firm called Hart Cars based in Farnborough. And I remember saying, well, yes, is it okay to use that? I need to go to the airport. They're like, yeah, just book it. And I remembered like going, well, can I use it for this? Yeah, just book it. And eventually you didn't ask. And I remember thinking, this is surely unsustainable. This is just a taxi company that we have at our disposal to take us anywhere we need to go. And so over time, controls and constraints started to try and creep in, as we matured as a company, as we matured as an organisation. But yeah, it was a huge, huge culture shock coming from a company that had a policy for, what you could spend on a hotel. I remember being told at one point I should persuade the customer to rearrange a meeting because there are no cheap hotels near them that day, and you need to remain within policy on the hotel limit. And I remember thinking, I can't tell this customer spending millions with us. I can't say, well, I can't get a hotel for under this threshold, so can we change the date? At VMware, there was none of that. It was do the right thing for the customer, focus on the customer. Customer comes first, and that was very different. But it also explains something that you immediately realised when you joined VMware and you started to go and see the customers. And that's that the customers loved us. They absolutely loved us. I used to go to customer meetings previously, and sometimes you think, I'm going to have a bad experience, I'm going to have an unhappy customer. When you were going to see a customer as a VMware employee, they loved the product, they loved what you did, they loved the company, and the product that you sold just worked. It just did what it said on the tin. And there was this amazing halo effect around the company. When I think back probably from 2010 through to 2015, 2016, it was an amazing journey. It was explosive growth. But it was explosive growth with love from the customer. It wasn't, you've become big and we don't like you. It was like the customers were cheering us on from the sidelines. And it was so uplifting. It was just an incredible thing to be a part of. And inside, the company was learning, and the company was growing. And what was interesting working out of the UK was watching those early days of the company getting its head around becoming a global company. I'll never forget Carl Eschenbach speaking at one of our worldwide kickoffs, and they were a new thing for me, right? I'd never had a worldwide sales kickoff. So the idea of flying the whole company to sort of Las Vegas and doing this was alien to me. And I'll never forget that Carl was on stage, and he's a really charismatic speaker. But the cross-cultural reaction to Carl in the audience was amazing. So Carl's up on stage, and he's basically crying. He's basically so passionately in love with his almost congregation in front of him. He's loving us. And the folks from the US are cheering him on. Oh my God, this is amazing. The folks from Europe are kind of going, it's crying. It's a bit awkward. The people from the Far East were going, my leader is crying. It's a sign of weakness. This is a disaster. This is what's happening. And it was amazing reflecting afterwards, depending on who you spoke to. People just had a totally different reaction to Carl's passion. And it was amazing watching the different cultural responses to a leader who had his way of doing things and his way of communicating, and how that landed across sort of different sections of this rapidly growing global company.
So how did you approach those differences in style and delivery and cultural reception when your role right now is to go out and talk to people and help them solve their problems, and those discussions are going to vary widely across the geographic area that you're covering, right?
It's been fascinating working for a company based in California, and I've concluded that in the world there are basically three bubbles. There's the bubble of California, there's the bubble of the US, and then there's the bubble of the rest of the world. And you can see policy and approach is tailored depending on which of those three bubbles it comes from. And so I think what we found certainly in the UK is, I think we're probably one of the largest geo by revenue outside of the US. But you spend a lot of time helping tailor the message. Even to recently, thinking about back to the last Explore, we were having conversations around the messaging we want to use is this idea of offense and defense, and I remember saying that's great. It works great in the US, but in Europe we don't have the concept of offense and defense in any sort of sporting context. So what you actually said is, I'd like to talk to you about my offensive strategy. That doesn't land quite so well. And it has been interesting, right? There's a whole bunch of nuances, whether it's you have to accept that everything's spelt wrong. There are Zs where there should be S's in words. No one can spell colour. But then there are things that it just doesn't matter. Again, the level of passion that exudes from the company and from corporate, for want of a better word. Sometimes it doesn't matter if it doesn't connect culturally or in the right way, because you can see the message. It's obvious. And what's interesting is particularly when you saw Pat come in and Pat take the reins. That was actually a moment where it was clear that cultural alignment and not that people previously hadn't valued culture, but culture started to become much more important. It's really hard to describe the shift that happened when Pat came in. But VMware gained something that I don't think it realised it needed, and that was a really positive approach to culture and inclusion and difference. And that's Pat's legacy, and that very much lives on.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the CTO ambassador role. Tell us about that role. What was its purpose and how did you execute?
So I remember about a year after joining, I was chatting to now a really good friend at the time. I revered this guy, Joe Bagley. He was our EMEA CTO. And he was telling me about this thing that he'd done the year before. It was the CTO Ambassador Conference. And it was a conference of our top technical people coming together across the company and effectively providing bi-directional feedback to our product lines who are inventing stuff. And then it was the opportunity for the product lines to listen to the field and hear what was going on with customers. And I wasn't eligible to be the CTO Ambassador organization because I wasn't in a technical role. I was in this advisory, this consulting organization. And I remember I thought, well, I'm going to pitch myself forward. I'm going to see what happens. And so I pitched myself forwards to be in the CTO Ambassador organization as this consultant role, and I got accepted. And it was a really humbling experience. I'll touch on something that we're doing in Europe that reminded me of it. But you suddenly find yourself in a room at the CTO Ambassador Annual Conference, which is this week in Palo Alto, where you get the ear of leadership, the ear of some of the thought leaders in the company, and therefore the industry. And I had a real imposter syndrome moment. I was like, oh my God, I shouldn't be here. But I remained in the CTO Ambassador organization for about 4 or 5 years, and it cemented relationships that I have today. As I record this, a few weeks ago I was presenting at VMware Explore in Las Vegas, and I followed Raghu on stage at our executive day, and we greeted each other like old friends backstage. And those friendships I can go all the way back. In fact, it was a trip that we did one evening. It was an evening reception at the Computer History Museum. And I'd critiqued something that Raghu had been doing. He was a product manager at the time, and I remember I got told, Raghu's trying to find you. He's here and he's trying to find you because he's heard what you've said about his. It was the naming of something. I said this is a ridiculous name. And that was my first proper contact with Raghu, and he basically confronted up to me and he said, I hear that you think my name for this thing is wrong. And I said, well, it could be better. And that was my first interaction with him. But that was through the CTO Ambassador organization. And today, I'm really fortunate to have some really good relationships with leadership members of the company. And that's forged through that organization. And I've never come across anything quite like it anywhere else. And I've never come across anything that instills quite as much pride in people to be part of it as anything else. And it's reinvented itself over the years, and the current stewardship is working out what that's going to look like going forwards, I'm sure. But yeah, for me, that catapulted my sort of stakeholders and relationships that I had. That meant, I think for the first time after being in there a few years, I started to feel confident at VMware like I did in my previous career. Because at BT, I had the relationships. I could dial 1-800 CEO and make stuff happen. And for the first time at VMware, through being part of that organization, I started to forge the relationships, and incredibly privileged, right? I got to follow Raghu 2 years in a row on stage at our executive summit. I get to invite Kit Colbert on stage to follow me afterwards. These are not positions or roles or opportunities that I ever expected to have when I joined as advisory services employee number 3 back in the day, and certainly never expected to be asked to be sat here recording what to me feels like an insignificant history. But someone somewhere clearly felt I had a story to tell.
Absolutely. I think you absolutely do. I want to hear more about what you've been doing over the last 5 years or so, kind of.
So
where have things gone with VMware?
So in about 2016, I was pushing the boundaries of advisory services. I was starting to see the potential for the company. I was also starting to see potential problems and where I thought we were not making errors, but what if we thought about this differently, kind of things. And I remember a conversation that was with our EMEA, it was our EMEA VP, Jean-Pierre. So he's now our global VP of sales. And I remember having this conversation. I said, what if it turned out customers don't care about infrastructure? I don't think they care about infrastructure. I think they care about the applications and workloads, and the infrastructure is just a dirty byproduct. When the first people went to IBM and said, I need you to digitize my ledger, they didn't say, I want a mainframe or I want a data center. They said, I want to digitize the ledger. The mainframe and the data center was what followed and was needed. And so I started to say to Jean-Pierre, I think we are going to have to pivot. And we've won the argument for why virtualization. We've won the argument for why you want to have a software-defined data center. Now we need to explain to people why what matters is how you put workloads on it. And so Jean-Pierre and my boss at the time, a guy called Alan Barber, who was the VP of pre-sales in EMEA, pulled me out of advisory services and said, right, put your money where your mouth is. Be careful what you ask for. Put your money where... You need to start to figure out how are we going to start to pivot the language, the conversation, hiring, so that we can start to engage more on what are the applications you're trying to run, and then how can I demonstrate VMware is the right place to run those applications. And I came up with a really simple story that to this day I still get asked to tell. And it was just a really simple sales narrative, and it had a hashtag, and it was hashtag run all the things. And run all the things was distilling down my previous 4 or 5 years of VMware contact with customers. And some of them they'd say we have a single hypervisor policy, right? So in the early days, it was a hypervisor fight, whose hypervisor won. Some customers would say it's a data center consolidation story. But really, they were all saying they wanted one thing. What they were saying was they wanted one platform to run all the things. I don't want to have silos of infrastructure. I don't want to have silos of technology, silos of expertise. And IT loves a silo, right? We are all in on silos. Silos are how we define ourselves. They're how we, in progression through the silo is how we define our journey. You think about Cisco and networking is a great example, right? Everyone wants to go through the Cisco exam hierarchy, and what they're really doing is they're moving up their network silo in hierarchical steps. And I said, we need to try and break out of that. And so created this narrative called Run All the Things, and said that's what we have to sell. We have to sell that we are the platform not to virtualize all the things. That's what we were saying before. Before, we were the platform to virtualize stuff. Now we're the platform to run stuff. Rather than looking down to the infrastructure, now we need to look up to the business lines and the people who are owning the technology and convince them that we're the platform to run all the things. That's evolved today to a really simple way that I describe the problem that we solve for customers. Customers only have one question, right? We can call it multi-cloud, we can call it private AI, we can call it a million things. But really the customer has one question. What should I run where and why? And that's it. And they're constantly asking that question. And you can have a grand phrase for it, like application portfolio management. But the reality is they're just saying, am I running my applications in the right place, in the right way, at the right time? And do I understand it? And that's it. And so, whether you're talking about applications at the edge, applications on public cloud, applications in private cloud, applications on devices, what VMware is really solving for today is how can we provide you one platform to run all the things, and where in the old days with Diane, we were having a conversation about it's any server vendor under us, and she'd have the big number at VMworld that said we now have 156 server vendors certified. And above us, it was we have 364 operating systems certified. And that was effectively how we won, right? It was choice of infrastructure under us, choice of operating system above us. I suddenly had this moment of realization that now it's going to be about cloud vendors underneath us and platforms and applications above us, right? Nothing's changed. It's just what we're focusing on delivering the choice for has changed. So before we were focused on solving server sprawl, and 1 year you had a bunch of servers from IBM, 2 years later you procured them from Supermicro, 2 years later you procured them from someone else. Today that server sprawl is cloud sprawl. And so all my focus has just been on how do we better have conversations with customers about their workloads. What do you want to do with them, and how do I demonstrate that VMware is the place to run them? How do I demonstrate we're the platform to run all the things? Whether that's at the edge, whether that's in the public clouds, whether that's in your private cloud environment, it shouldn't matter. I still see slide decks today where someone will put the hashtag run all the things. And then we've also had, then the cloud management business unit, they had manage all things. And then even at one point, our friends at Pivotal, they had build all the things. So yes, that was pretty cool to see that sort of grow legs and get its own life. But that's what I've been focused on. And so, I spend time working with our teams. We call it go-to-market. But what they're really doing is they're trying to work out how to tell a story, right? I've effectively become a storyteller. I've become a narrator. And my job is to go to customers and tell them how we can help solve their problems in the language of a story. No longer describing a product feature, but phrases and sentences that open with imagine if. What would it mean to you if? As opposed to I can deliver you this or I can deliver you that. And so I have this super privileged role now. I sit as a senior director for app and cloud platforms, but really I'm exec sponsor for a whole bunch of customers and partners. I get involved and help critique and deliver some of the core messages that the company gets to build. And that's really humbling. I joined in awe of what the company was doing, and now I find myself sat in meetings deciding and helping define what the company might do tomorrow. And then I also get to give back. So I've been afforded the latitude to identify and plug holes, and one of the holes that I identified was I wanted to do more for our top talent. And this is what I alluded to earlier when I was talking about the CTO Ambassador program, so I'll come back to something. We created a top talent program in EMEA. So if CTO Ambassador was about top technical talent and developing deep technical skills and the technology relationships, one of the things that I wanted to do was to work out how do we help develop the career skills and the soft skills of some of our top talent in the pre-sales organization. So we built a talent organization, and there's about 60, 70 members in it across Europe at the moment. And I had my second imposter syndrome moment that I remembered from my first CTO Ambassador conference at the first roadshow event that we did with them. And I found myself standing up in front of some of the most amazing and inspiring people that I get the pleasure of working with across Europe. And I had this really weird moment where I was like, why am I here? What right do I have to stand in front of you? You people are doing some of the most amazing stuff in the company. And it was everyone from grads who had just joined, right? One of the things I was really passionate about was that our focus on talent shouldn't just be senior talent and tenured talent. I always wanted to make the point that we have amazing talent in VMware, from new people who have just joined with new opinions and new approaches, all the way through to sort of long tenured principals. And I remember standing in a London office and having a very humbling, sobering moment. And I think I said to them, I said, I feel like an imposter standing in front of you. The collective wisdom that's in this room is incredible, and I really hope that we can do something with this talent community going forwards to help you get the best and be the best that you can be. And that's full circle, because I remember at BT, I was desperate to be in what we called the technical talent pool. And so to then find myself sitting on the pre-sales leadership team for VMware in Europe and building that function, that was super cool, and testament to the trust that VMware would put in its people, right? No one asked me to set it up, but I just realized it was needed, and everyone went, yes, let's do it, make it happen.
So who are the people that you would point to as having helped you develop in your career? You mentioned Joe Bagley. Other people that you would point to who really gave you opportunities, mentored you?
So I would say there are probably three people. Two of them have been managers, and one of them has been not a manager. So I think the first one is probably Joe. Joe is one of the most and least approachable people that I know. He is incredibly supportive of people, and he's a few years older than me, and if I can be half as good as he is as supporting people when I'm at his point in his career, I'll be very happy. And I can still remember my first interaction with Joe. It was my very first kickoff, and the BT account team had asked me for my help in counselling them in how better to sell back into BT. And there was something we wanted to do. I can't even remember what it was, but we needed Joe's buy-in. Basically, we'd realised that we needed Joe to sign off on this. I remember, quietly sidling up to him in a breakout session and trying to get his attention. And yeah, he might say something totally different, but I built a great relationship with Joe. We're good friends now. We hang out at non-work stuff together. We do stuff together, and hang out with his family. But the relationship there was effectively built and bonded over time at VMware, and both passionately wanting to do the right thing by our people and by our customers. And so Joe has been an amazing out of band mentor, right? Who doesn't sit in my management line, he's over here. And so he can tell me when I'm being a cock. And he has done on many occasions. And he's reined, he said, no, I wouldn't have done that. And that's been invaluable, because sometimes that's a conversation that you can't have in a traditional manager relationship. And I think the other two people that have shaped me and rounded me are probably my last two managers. So when Jean-Pierre called my bluff and said, figure this applications thing out then, I got parachuted into Alan Barber's team. And Alan Barber was the VP of Professional Services, a very long-term VMware employee. He'd just taken over the role of pre-sales. And I keep talking about humbling moments, but yeah, I remember he invited me to his team meeting. And I suddenly found myself sitting for the first time at an EMEA leadership meeting, where before I felt very much like a cog in the machine. Now suddenly I had this. It was very strange sitting in my first European leadership team meeting. And Alan, I can only assume Alan saw a flash of talent somewhere that needed a bit of rounding off, and I owe Alan a huge debt, and he lives just like probably no more than 5 miles away from me in the UK, and occasionally we bump into each other running. We have a place that we go running, and we bump into each other. And Alan did an amazing job of mentoring and helping me and investing time with me, not because he was asked to or because he needed to, but because that was what Alan did, and that was the culture in the company, was that you help and you nurture. There's no blame culture. There was no running someone down, or no one wanted to see anyone fail. And Alan was the personification of that. And actually, the second person would be the person that replaced Alan. So Alan got a global role and had an opportunity to come and work in Palo Alto. And I got a new manager, a guy called Colin Bannister. And Colin, he retired a couple of years ago. And he told it as it was. He was half Scottish, half Jamaican, which is an unusual combination. But he did not dress anything up. And so if Alan had softly rounded off the edges that he could best round off with some gentle sandpaper, Colin took an angle grinder to the rest. And I'm not perfect. I'm far from perfect. But Colin gave the next level of help that I needed in order to continue to progress. I remember, to this day, I would still think, what would Colin do? What would Colin say? We're still in touch. I actually dropped in on Colin on my stag do. So for my stag party, we took a road trip up the west coast of Scotland, where Colin now has a house in one of the islands off the west coast of Scotland. Actually, Joe was on my stag party. He was driving an Aston Martin DB9 as we did this road trip up the west coast with a whole bunch of other VMware colleagues. We dropped in on Colin in his little town of Tobermory on the Isle of Mull. And yeah, I think the fact that I bothered to go and drop in on him on my stag do was testament to the impact that he'd had. And he's great. He's retired now. I hope when he looks at his spreadsheet of stock prices, the VMware stock prices is doing what he hopes it's doing, because it's all part of his retirement plan. But yeah, it was Joe and Alan and Colin, I think, were probably the people that shaped me through contact with me. I could list a whole bunch of other people, who inspired me, but they were probably the ones that I had like day-to-day contact with.
That's kind of all I have on my list. The last question I have on my list, which I've been asking everyone, is what do you think is the lasting impact of VMware's technology?
I don't think the lasting impact of VMware has anything to do with its technology. I think the lasting impact of VMware has to do on the change that technology brings. VMware changed how people could use compute. VMware put slow, complex access to technology into a simple programmatic request for something. And that sounds really oversimplified. But the impact of that is it's transformed the way healthcare works. It keeps borders safe. It runs nuclear submarines. It also runs schools. It secures the devices in the hands of flight attendants. And I don't really think there are many companies that you can point to that have had that kind of impact across the board. We don't sell to consumers, right? So the average consumer has no idea who we are. When someone asks me who I work for, I say I work for the largest software company you've never heard of. But while you haven't heard of us, we've touched you. And you don't realize how we've touched you. We don't realize the impact that we've made to your life. And for that, I'm really proud. And that's the legacy. And we worked hard for that.